She was young, radiant, and unstoppable, a woman whose laughter could turn a gray day into gold. But somewhere in the shadows, danger was watching, danger she thought she could reason with. For months, it whispered promises and sweet lies, wrapping itself around her life like a vine, tightening with every passing day. And when she finally dared to speak the truth, the vine turned to a noose. This is not just a story about love gone wrong. It's about how secrets can grow teeth, and how one man's fear of exposure would unleash a cruelty no heart could fathom. Welcome to True Crime's Altar, where every sin is punished, every betrayal has a cost, and every soul must answer to the truth. Like, comment, and subscribe, because these are the stories the guilty prayed would stay buried. The night air in Eastford carried the scent of summer rain, the kind that lingers after a storm, fresh yet heavy. In a modest brick home on the south side, 20-year-old Laniah Foster sat cross-legged on her bed, twisting a section of hair while humming along to a song playing from her phone. Her walls were covered in vision boards, photos of smiling clients, shelves of makeup palettes, and a handwritten note, licensed by 2025. She had plans, big ones. Her mother, Denise, often said her daughter had a gift for making people feel beautiful without changing who they were. Laniah wanted to be a certified cosmetologist, maybe even own her own studio one day. She'd once dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, then an orthodontist, but beauty was where her hands came alive. She was close to her family, Denise, her stepfather Jerome, and her younger brother Malik. Sunday dinners were sacred, and laughter was the main course. To them, she was the sun, warm, steady, dependable. But every sun casts shadows. It was a year and a half ago when she met Darian Cole, a man nearly twice her age. He had an easy smile, skin smooth as polished wood, and a way of making you feel like you were the only person in a crowded room. Darian owned a small auto shop in Eastford, the kind of place where customers lingered for conversation as much as for service. Laniah had gone there with her cousin after her car started making a strange rattle. He fixed it for cheap, joked that she should pay him in home-cooked meals instead. She laughed. She didn't know then that he was married. That truth came later, whispered to her like an afterthought. By then, she was already answering his late-night texts and slipping away for drives down quiet back roads. The first time they kissed, it was in the back of his car under a street lamp that flickered like it was keeping a secret. His wedding ring was in his pocket that night. She had noticed but didn't say a word. It was a small silence, but silence can be the first step toward complicity. They kept their connection hidden, no dates in public, no photos. He told her it was for her protection, but she suspected it was for his. At first, she accepted it, convincing herself that what they had was different, special. The weeks turned to months, and the secrecy became heavier. She started canceling plans with friends, staying home on weekends, waiting for his calls. Darian would show up unannounced, sometimes with small gifts, sometimes with nothing but the weight of his presence. He had a way of making her feel chosen, and yet she was always in the shadows. One evening, sitting in his car outside a closed diner, she asked him why they couldn't just be seen together. His jaw tightened. Complicated was his favorite word, the shield he used to keep her questions at bay. And each time she let it go, she felt a little piece of herself go with it. "You deserve better than this," her best friend Kira told her after Laniah confided part of the truth. "You're hiding like you did something wrong." But Laniah brushed it off, saying Kira didn't understand. It is the quietest compromises that open the loudest doors to ruin. The more she invested in him, the more she felt the edges of her life blur. Her mother noticed she was more withdrawn. Malik noticed she laughed less. Jerome said nothing but watched her closely. Darian's visits became unpredictable, sometimes tender, sometimes distant. There were nights when he would talk about his struggles, about the weight of providing for a family. She would listen, trying to patch holes she didn't make. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the cicadas sang in the trees, Darian took her for a drive. They passed the same route they always took, but he was quieter than usual. "You ever think about the future?" she asked. He gripped the wheel tighter. "Not like this," he said. The air between them shifted, thick with something unspoken. She didn't know it then, but a seed had been planted, one that would grow in the dark until it strangled everything it touched. Laniah's life began to orbit around Darian's schedule. She would plan her evenings by his hints, keeping her phone close enough to feel its warmth in her palm. Sometimes he would vanish for days, and when he reappeared, it was with an apology wrapped in charm. "Work's been crazy," he'd say, but his eyes darted like he was scanning for loose threads. She wanted to believe him. Most nights, she did. The more she gave, the more he took not just her time, but the easy openness she once carried with everyone. Denise noticed the change. "You're home less, and when you are, you're somewhere else in your head," she said one evening as they folded laundry together. Laniah smiled it off, but her hands kept folding the same shirt twice. Darian's stories began to twist, details about his job, about his wife, about where he'd been. Once, he mentioned his cousin's birthday party, then later said it had been canceled. She started collecting these slips in the back of her mind, though she never laid them on the table. Each one was a tiny cut, and a person can only ignore so many cuts before they start to bleed. Still, there were moments when she felt powerful in his arms, moments when the world shrank to just the sound of his voice. But even then, something inside her whispered that power without respect is only a performance. As the months passed, small arguments began to surface. She would ask why he couldn't answer her calls after 9 p.m. He would deflect, sometimes with humor, sometimes with sharpness that made her retreat. One rainy afternoon, they sat in his car, the windows fogging from their breath. "Do you love her?" she asked suddenly. His eyes shifted to the windshield. "That's not a fair question." "It's a yes or no," she said, softer now. He started the engine instead of answering. A choice made in silence is still a choice, and often the loudest kind. Laniah confided more in Kira, who urged her to step away. "You can't build a future on someone else's lies," Kira said over coffee one Sunday morning. But Laniah felt trapped between what she wanted to believe and what she knew deep down. She told herself she'd give him one more chance to prove her wrong. That chance came when Darian invited her to the outskirts of Eastford, where the streetlights thinned and the stars took over. He brought takeout, played her favorite song, and for a few hours she forgot the gnawing doubt. It was moments like these that kept her tethered, even as the rope frayed. By late summer, the fights grew sharper. He accused her of pushing too hard. She accused him of keeping her locked in the dark. "You knew what this was," he said during one of their last arguments that season. She stared at him, realizing she had never actually agreed to those terms. He had simply written them for her. Love that demands silence in exchange for presence is not love at all, but captivity dressed in velvet. One evening in early September, after another canceled plan, she sat alone on her bed, scrolling through old texts from him. The words that once made her heart race now felt hollow. Her reflection in the darkened window looked tired, older somehow. That was when she decided she couldn't stay in the shadows any longer. What she didn't yet realize was that pulling a single thread can sometimes unravel far more than you intended. It began with a rumor Laniah wasn't supposed to hear. A friend of a friend mentioned seeing Darian at a cookout in another part of town, his arm loosely draped around a woman who wasn't her. The woman, they said, wasn't a stranger. She was his wife. Laniah's chest tightened. She had always known about the marriage, but in her mind it was an arrangement, hollow and loveless. Hearing they appeared like a couple in public made the lie heavier. She asked him about it the next time they spoke. "People talk," he said, brushing it away. "You know how folks are." But his voice was sharp on the edges, as if daring her to keep pressing. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every promise he'd made. The pieces no longer fit. By the next week, the decision formed in her mind, not in a rush of anger, but in the quiet clarity that comes when truth demands air. She found his wife's number. Her thumb hovered over the call button. When she finally pressed it, her voice trembled, but her words were steady. She told her who she was, how long it had been going on, the things Darian had said. On the other end, there was silence, then a clipped, "I'll deal with it." Choices made in the name of truth can still unleash storms you can't control. When Darian found out, he didn't call her right away. Instead, he called Denise. His tone was polite, almost respectful, but the words were a warning. "I think it's best I end things with your daughter," he said. Denise, caught off guard, asked why he was speaking to her about it. She's been reaching out to my wife, he replied, his voice tightening. When Denise hung up, she sat for a long time at the kitchen table, uneasy. She wanted to ask Laniah about it, but something told her the truth would come out soon enough. In the days that followed, Darian's behavior shifted. The warmth in his messages cooled. He would respond late, if at all. When they met, he was quieter, watching her more than talking. One evening, as they sat in his parked car, he looked at her and said, "You've made things complicated." She met his gaze. "I just told the truth." For a moment, he said nothing, but his jaw worked like he was chewing words too bitter to swallow. There is a particular kind of pride that sees truth not as light, but as a weapon aimed at the self. That pride will do anything to snuff it out. Laniah told Kira about the call, about Darian's reaction. "You did what you had to," Kira said. "He's the one who should be worried." But worry was already creeping in. Darian began showing up near her house unexpectedly, parking a few houses down. He claimed he just wanted to talk, but the sight of his car idling made her skin crawl. She didn't tell her family about those visits. Some part of her still believed he wouldn't cross a certain line. In the last week before everything changed, the air between them was thick with things unsaid. When he called her late one evening, asking to meet the following weekend, she agreed, though her gut twisted. That Friday night, she texted Kira, "If anything feels off tomorrow, I'll leave." She never sent another message after that. The morning sun over Eastford was pale, as if it, too, was hesitant to rise. Laniah woke early, her hair tied back, her favorite earrings on. She moved quietly around the house, texting her mother a smiling emoji before slipping out the door. Denise, making coffee, glanced at her phone and smiled back, never imagining it would be the last message. Darian was waiting in a black sedan, engine idling. She slid into the passenger seat, the faint smell of motor oil and cologne filling the air. They drove without much talk, the city giving way to quieter streets where the houses thinned. When they finally parked outside a vacant lot, the silence between them was jagged. "We need to talk," he said. She nodded, bracing herself. "You shouldn't have gone to her," he began, his voice low but vibrating with something darker. "She had the right to know," she replied, keeping her gaze forward. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles pale. "You think you understand, but you don't." He turned toward her, and in that moment the conversation cracked into violence. His hand shot to her neck, a flash of cold steel in his other hand. She gasped, clawing at his arm. A passerby, a friend of his, would later tell police he saw Darian on top of her in the car, heard her scream, "He cut my throat." The man froze, then fumbled for his phone, calling 911 with shaking hands. The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost detached, asking for details he could barely form. Evil often doesn't look monstrous until it is too close to stop. Laniah fought, her voice breaking, her hands desperate. Darian's face was set, his movements deliberate. She tried to kick the door open, but he dragged her back, the knife catching the light in a way that burned itself into the witness's mind. Within minutes, the car was gone before sirens could arrive. Police swept the area but found nothing. Hours passed, the September afternoon fading into dusk. Denise's calls went unanswered. Jerome drove the streets, scanning for her car. At 8:47 p.m., an officer's voice crackled over the radio. There was a body in an alley off Vinton and Rhodes. She was bound. A gunshot wound through her side, her skin scorched. The fire had been small but intentional, a cruel attempt to erase her. The alley smelled of burnt fabric and gasoline. The officer who found her turned away, pressing his lips together. Cruelty that tries to hide itself only deepens its own damnation. News of her death rippled through Eastford like a wave that refused to break. Denise collapsed on the kitchen floor when officers came to the door. Jerome held her, his own face wet but his voice steady enough to answer their questions. Malik sat in the hallway, back against the wall, staring at the floor. That night, under the same dim streetlights she used to pass on her way home, candles began to appear, one, then two, then dozens, until the whole corner flickered. Kira stood among the crowd, whispering Laniah's name like a prayer that had come too late. When officers knocked on the Cole residence that night, Darian's wife answered, her face composed in a way that suggested she had been rehearsing. She told them her husband had been home with her all evening. Her voice was smooth, her eyes steady, but lies, no matter how well dressed, still leave their shoes muddy. Investigators didn't challenge her right away. They simply noted the times, thanked her, and left. The next morning, detectives began gathering surveillance footage from the streets near the vacant lot in the alley. By midday, the wife's alibi was crumbling. There he was on camera, Darian's car sliding through intersections far from his neighborhood. That same footage showed another vehicle trailing behind him, a burgundy SUV registered to his brother-in-law, Maurice Holloway. Maurice was known to police, his record peppered with small time charges, nothing like what he was now wrapped up in. When questioned, he claimed he knew nothing about the murder, but phone records told a different story. Calls between him and Darian in the hours before and after Laniah's death, pinging off towers near the scene. Choosing to shield the killer is to inherit his crime in the eyes of history. The net began to tighten. Darian was arrested outside the auto shop, his hands raised, his eyes darting between the officers and the crowd that had gathered. Maurice was taken in the same day, his head low, as if that might make him smaller. News of the arrests spread fast. In Eastford, people gathered for vigils, speaking Laniah's name into microphones, lighting candles until the night glowed. Denise attended one of the first, standing with Jerome and Malik at her sides. She spoke briefly, her voice trembling but clear. She was more than what happened to her, and she deserved to be safe. Kira stood nearby, clutching a framed photo. The media seized on the story, the young woman with dreams cut short, the older married man with a hidden life, the tangled cover-up. Reporters called it a crime that stunned the community. But for those who had loved her, stunned wasn't the word. It was hollowed. In the days before the trial, court records revealed Darian's long history. Over a dozen prior convictions, from narcotics possession to probation violations, even a 10-year stretch behind bars in the mid-90s. To many, it painted the portrait of a man well-practiced in avoiding consequences. Maurice's own record, though lighter, was still marked, and now this case would etch its darkest entry yet. On the courthouse steps, Jerome told the reporter, "We want justice, but we also want people to see the warning here. This could happen to anyone who thinks love can survive in secrecy. A choice to harm one life sends cracks through many, sometimes through an entire city." The trial date was set for the spring. In the meantime, Darian sat in county lockup, his bond set at $500,000. Morris's bond was a fraction of that, but still enough to keep him behind bars. Denise visited the cemetery once a week, bringing fresh flowers and speaking softly to her daughter's headstone, as if updating her on the latest turns in the case. The leaves began to change, but the grief stayed the same color. The trial began on a gray Monday morning. The courtroom was crowded, family, reporters, neighbors. Denise sat in the front row, clutching a tissue in one hand and Jerome's arm in the other. Darian entered wearing a suit that didn't hide the weight he'd lost in jail. He kept his eyes down as the charges were read: first-degree intentional homicide, possession of a firearm by a felon, mutilation of a corpse. The prosecution opened with the timeline of that September day, playing the witness's frantic 911 call, the sound of fear and disbelief filling the silent room. Photos from the scene were shown, each one pulling a gasp from the gallery. Morris's role was laid bare too. The phone records, the surveillance, the way he lingered near the alley before the fire. His defense claimed he was only there to help, that he hadn't known what Darian planned. But helping to bury the truth is helping to bury the victim. Darian's lawyer tried to paint him as a man under emotional strain, but the jury saw the pattern: a man who controlled, concealed, and finally destroyed what he could not keep. After 3 days of testimony and 6 hours of deliberation, the verdict was read: guilty on all counts. Denise closed her eyes, a tear sliding down her cheek. Jerome's jaw set in quiet relief. At sentencing, the judge looked at Darian for a long moment before speaking. This was not a crime of passion. This was deliberate, cruel, and meant to erase her from this world. You failed. Darian was given life without parole. Maurice faced lesser charges but still years behind bars. Outside the courthouse, Denise addressed the small crowd of cameras. If you're in a relationship where you feel unsafe, unseen, or silenced, please don't wait. Tell someone. Go to the people who can help you before it's too late. Love is never real if it asks you to hide in the dark. Love that fears the light is not love, but possession, and possession will destroy both itself and you. The months that followed were quieter. The vigils slowed, the headlines faded, but the absence in Denise's home did not. Malik started a small scholarship in his sister's name for young women studying cosmetology. Kira volunteered with a local women's shelter, telling parts of Laniah's story to those who needed to hear it most. Seasons changed, but the lesson stayed. There is no shame in asking for help. The only shame is in a world that makes people afraid to. Thank you for watching this story. Let us know in the comments what you think and share your thoughts on how we can better protect one another. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories like this and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your voice matters here, just as every life in these stories matters.